morning of August 10, 2019, the single most high-profile inmate in the modern history of the federal prison system, Jeffrey Epstein, was found dead in his cell after an inexplicable series of events. In the course of just a few days, he was taken off of suicide watch. His cellmate was transferred to a different cell and not replaced, and the guards in his unit skipped their required twice-hourly rounds, leaving him alone and unobserved for several hours. The jail had 2 cameras trained on the areas around Epstein's cell, but the feds claimed that both had malfunctioned that night, so there was no video evidence to release. Jeffrey Epstein had enjoyed incredible good luck up to this point. In 2007, despite police identifying over 50 mostly underage victims of his abuse, Epstein was offered a sweetheart deal in which he pled guilty to a single charge of procuring in exchange for federal immunity, both for himself and for any potential co-conspirators, and a few months of work release from a private wing of a Florida prison. Epstein had his mansions wired with video and audio recording devices, and police and the FBI had confiscated boxes full of hard drives, computers, cameras, and physical media in both the 2007 and 2019 cases, evidence which almost certainly contained the sexual blackmail material that served as the nexus of Epstein's power. In any other case, this material, or at least a written inventory of its contents, would be a matter of public record. But in the Epstein case, the entire American political class closed ranks to maintain a cover-up that's totally bipartisan in nature, despite the occasional empty posturing to the contrary. The feds decided long ago that Ghislaine Maxwell is the only person who will ever serve prison time for the trafficking ring, apparently content to let the single most important part of the entire case, the blackmail material, disappear down the memory hole with no timetable or serious prospect for release. Years later, Alex Acosta, the U.S. attorney who gave Epstein his sweetheart plea deal, was rewarded with an appointment as Donald Trump's Secretary of Labor after privately admitting what many had long suspected. He let Epstein off easy because he was told that Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. For most Americans, the Epstein case provided only a brief peek behind the curtain at America's depraved political and financial elites, a shocking story about private jets, private islands, and recreational child abuse. But what fewer people realize is that Epstein's operation was just the newest iteration of a trafficking and blackmail blueprint that's been followed for generations by those seeking leverage over America's most powerful people and institutions. This blackmail strategy has been so pervasive and was used in service of so many different interests that some suspect if it was all revealed, the history of modern American politics would have to be completely rewritten. This video series is about what remains when you remove the agendas, the speculation, and the conspiracy theories to examine the plain facts of political sexual blackmail and its role in modern American history. So because political sexual blackmail touches on issues of sexual deviance, organized crime, espionage, and multiple forms of illegality, topics which everyone involved is incentivized to keep secret, finding verifiable information about this topic can be extremely difficult, and the research in this area varies wildly in credibility. Very few people are willing to publicly admit to being blackmailed, so the relevant sources of information are almost always third parties, and range from testimony from local police busting up blackmail rings, to declassified FBI files, memoirs written by mobsters, and interviews with jilted ex-lovers. The point of this video series is to go beyond mere accusations, to examine the actual sources being cited and the credibility of each individual claim being made. To be clear, this series is not a summary, rehashing, or debunking of any prior work. Rather, it is for people who want to know what the actual evidence is, regardless of which narrative or interpretation it may support. Unfortunately, much of the most famous and widely cited published material on this subject sets out with the objective of proving overarching conspiracies, and in my opinion, sometimes tortures the evidence to do so. This series will use books like Nation Under Blackmail Volumes 1 and 2 by Whitney Webb, The Franklin Cover-Up by John DeCamp, The Franklin Scandal, and Confessions of a D.C. Madam by Nick Bryant, as well as articles like Sex Scandals and Sexual Blackmail in America's Deep Politics from Lobster Magazine, as a jumping-off point to examine the original sources and individuals quoted in those works, so the viewer can decide for himself what is credible. In early February of 1960, during his campaign for the presidency, then-Senator John F. Kennedy visited the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas for a meeting with Frank Sinatra. According to investigative reporter Seymour Hersh's book, The Dark Side of Camelot, at the hotel, Sinatra introduced Kennedy to a 20-something woman named Judith Campbell, and the two began an affair that lasted from 1960 until well into Kennedy's presidency, during which they stayed in frequent contact, but met up only sporadically. Years after Kennedy's death, during the Church Committee hearings about the CIA's abuses of power, a congressional report on the CIA assassination program mentioned that, quote, a close friend of President Kennedy had frequent contact with the president from the end of 1960 through mid-1962. FBI reports and testimony indicate that the president's friend was also a close friend of John Rosselli and Sam Giancana and saw them often during the same period. The press soon identified the president's friend mentioned in this report as Judith Campbell, also known as Judith Exner, and it turned out that during Campbell's affair with Kennedy, she had simultaneously been dating the Chicago-based mobster Sam Giancana. At some point, the FBI had bugged Campbell's phone, ostensibly to get information on Giancana, and in the process, they ended up recording her calls with Kennedy as well, the contents of which quickly made their way to the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. This information showed up in a congressional report on CIA assassinations because at that time, in the early 60s, the CIA had been actively cooperating with elements of the American Mafia in plans to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro, and Giancana was one of the central figures in this conspiracy. At the same time, JFK's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, was pursuing Giancana for prosecution on organized crime charges. The FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, would broach this topic with JFK in a way that Kennedy interpreted as an implicit threat of blackmail. According to Judith Campbell, as reported in Anthony Summers' book, Official and Confidential. Jack Kennedy called me that afternoon after he spoke to Hoover. He told me to go to my mother's house and call him from there. When I did, he said the phone in my apartment wasn't safe. He was furious. You could feel his anger. He said that at their meeting, Hoover had more or less tried to intimidate him with the information he had. He'd made it clear that he knew about my relationship with Jack, even that I'd been to the White House, that I was a friend of Sam and Johnny Rosselli, and that Jack knew Sam too. Jack knew exactly what Hoover was doing. Knowing that Jack wanted him out of office, he was in a way ensuring his job by letting Jack know he had this leverage over him. A similar allegation showed up in the 1999 book, Bound by Honor, the autobiography of the mobster and scion of the Bonanno crime family, Bill Bonanno. According to Bonanno, his organization had received word from Louis Rosenstiel, the millionaire liquor tycoon, that Hoover had successfully blackmailed Kennedy into reappointing him FBI director. According to Bonanno's book, Hoover had blackmailed JFK into reappointing him as director of the FBI after Bobby Kennedy had threatened to remove him when he reached mandatory retirement age. Rosenstiel confirmed what later was a rumor in the tabloids, that Hoover went to Kennedy and told him he would expose his affair with Judith Campbell if he was not allowed to continue in office. Rosenstiel said that Hoover presented Kennedy with wiretaps and other evidence that he was prepared to make public if he didn't go along. Kennedy went along. Now it's worth noting that Bill Bonanno was a repeat felon with convictions for mail fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and defrauding senior citizens, and that his autobiography, Bound by Honor, was savaged by critics upon its release for claiming, among other things, that the shot that killed JFK had actually been fired by mobster Johnny Rosselli while hiding in a storm drain beneath Dealey Plaza, so his accounting of events probably shouldn't be taken at face value. Nevertheless, it is true that at that time, Hoover was subject to laws that made his retirement by age 65 mandatory, and Hoover was born on January 1, 1895, making him 66 years old when JFK assumed the presidency. Judith Campbell, on the other hand, was one of the few people on Earth who JFK might have actually told about Hoover's blackmail, lending a much higher degree of credibility to her testimony. Kennedy ended up seeking an age limit exemption to reappoint Hoover as FBI director, despite clear indications that he and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, had intended to replace him, so whatever pressure Hoover exerted on JFK appears to have worked. But this wasn't the only extortionate demand that seems to have resulted from Kennedy's affair with Judith Campbell. By August of 1962, the FBI had been surveilling Campbell's apartment for some time, watching her 24 hours a day, supposedly to gather information on her other boyfriend, the mobster Sam Giancana. According to ABC News, those FBI agents witnessed an incident that may very well have been related to corporate espionage for blackmail material on JFK over a military contract worth $6.5 billion. That's almost $70 billion in 2025 money.
So did President Kennedy's involvement with Judith Campbell make him vulnerable to blackmail? This FBI document discovered during our reporting raises that question. Two FBI agents tell of watching a break-in at Campbell's Los Angeles apartment while she was out. The agents did nothing to stop it, but they did trace the intruder's car. It belonged to a man named I.B. Hale. Hale was the former FBI agent who was now a security chief for one of the nation's largest defense contractors, the General Dynamics Corporation. And 3 months after this break-in, General Dynamics was awarded the largest defense contract in American history to build the TFX fighter. But General Dynamics had not been the Pentagon's choice. The decision by the Kennedy administration to give General Dynamics the contract was so unexpected and so controversial that the Senate launched an investigation. But J. Edgar Hoover never told the Senate committee about the break-in at Judith Campbell's and the possibility that information obtained in her apartment was used to blackmail the president. The committee was still conducting hearings when the president went to Dallas in November 1963.
It's notable that this break-in was apparently masterminded by a former FBI agent. Where would this guy, supposedly outside of the FBI and working security for a military contractor, have received enough inside information to identify JFK's secret mistress's apartment and know about the potential blackmail material contained within it? Was Hoover slipping this information to contacts outside of the government? Or had Kennedy's affair become an open secret in the intelligence world? Predictably, this wouldn't be the last time that JFK's womanizing left him open to blackmail. In the summer of 1960, Kennedy was heading to the Democratic National Convention as the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee and was expected to announce his selection for vice president at the convention. It was widely understood by JFK's aides and campaign employees that Kennedy intended to offer the vice president position to Stuart Symington, a Democratic senator from Missouri, but on the eve of the convention, something changed. According to Kennedy's aide, Hyman Raskin, as reported in The Dark Side of Camelot, Stuart Symington was always at the top of Kennedy's short list of running mates. That list was precipitously and totally discarded when Kennedy met early on the morning after his nomination with Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House. At the meeting, Kennedy was made an offer he could not refuse. In other words, Raskin assumed Johnson blackmailed his way into the vice presidency. Raskin couldn't learn which aspect of the Kennedy history was cited by Johnson and Rayburn in making their threats, but he had no doubt that their morning meeting with Johnson disrupted months of careful planning and put the Kennedy campaign staff in an uproar. Johnson was not being given the slightest bit of consideration for the vice presidency by any of the Kennedys. The frontrunner in all previous discussions inside the campaign, Raskin knew, was the attractive Symington, who had served as Secretary of the Air Force during the Truman presidency. On the stuff I saw, Raskin told Hirsch in an interview, it was always Symington who was going to be the vice president. The Kennedy family had approved Symington, but after a mysterious private meeting with the then Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson and Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn on the eve of the Democratic Convention, to the amazement of his staff, Kennedy reversed course and decided to nominate Lyndon Johnson as vice president. It was obvious that something extraordinary had taken place, Raskin wrote. During my entire association with the Kennedys, I could not recall any situation where a decision of major significance had been reversed in such a short period of time. Bob Kennedy had always been involved in every major decision. Why not this one, I pondered. Kennedy said to Raskin, you know, we had never considered Lyndon, but I was left with no choice. He and Sam Rayburn made it damn clear to me that Lyndon had to be the candidate. Those bastards were trying to frame me. They threatened me with problems, and I don't need more problems. I'm going to have enough problems with Nixon. This same narrative was reiterated even more forcefully by Evelyn Lincoln, Kennedy's personal secretary during this period, in interviews for the book Official and Confidential. Lincoln was convinced that J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Johnson had conspired. Hoover was known to be personally close to Johnson. They lived on the same street in Northwest Washington and had for years provided Johnson with information about Kennedy's private life. Lincoln was quoted as saying that Johnson had been using all the information Hoover could find on Kennedy during the campaign, even before the convention, and Hoover was in on the pressure on Kennedy at the convention about womanizing and things in John's father, Joe Kennedy's background, and anything he could dig up. Johnson was using that as clout. Kennedy was angry because they had boxed him into a corner. He was absolutely boxed in. In a later interview for The Dark Side of Camelot, Lincoln told of finding JFK and his brother Robert deep in conversation early on the morning before announcing his vice presidential nomination. I went in and listened. They were very upset and trying to figure out how they could get around it, but they didn't know how they could do it. She didn't hear any mention then of a specific threat from Johnson, Lincoln said, but, she added, Jack knew that Hoover and LBJ would just fill the air with womanizing. Now, Lyndon Johnson was notoriously corrupt during his political career. He first won his Senate seat through blatant election fraud, and later became one of the most powerful senators in U.S. history, partially through bribery of his fellow legislators. As detailed in Robert Caro's biography, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, LBJ was not above buying votes and developed an entire patronage infrastructure in Washington to funnel money from Texas oil men to other politicians in exchange for political favors, so the prospect of Johnson using blackmail against JFK was totally within the realm of possibility. Whatever tactic Lyndon Johnson had used to pressure Kennedy, it was powerful enough to force a change of heart on perhaps the most consequential decision of his entire campaign, a mere 24 hours before that decision was to be made. Kennedy would go on to defeat Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential election, and Johnson would assume the vice presidency, a role that lasted for just 2 years until Johnson himself became president when JFK was assassinated. And despite being the victims of blackmail, the Kennedy family wasn't above authorizing blackmail as a tactic against their perceived political enemies. Most famously, Robert F. Kennedy, in his role as Attorney General, authorized J. Edgar Hoover's FBI to use sexual blackmail against Martin Luther King Jr. to try to force an end to his civil rights activism. Under the pretense of looking for communist associations, Hoover bugged MLK's phone lines and motel rooms, ultimately uncovering evidence of extramarital affairs, the existence of a love child King had sired with a mistress, and an ugly incident in which King sat by laughing while another pastor in his entourage sexually attacked a young parishioner in their hotel room. On November 21, 1964, a package containing a letter and an audio tape was delivered to King's address. The tape contained an audio recording of King engaging in sexual activity with one of his mistresses, retrieved from a bug in one of King's hotel rooms. The letter was written from the perspective of a disaffected black civil rights activist, accusing King of sexual immorality and implying that the author was preparing to release the audio tape. King, look into your heart. You know you're a complete fraud and a great liability to all of us. Lend your sexually psychotic ear to the enclosure. You will find yourself and in all your dirt, filth, evil, and moronic talk exposed on the record for all time. It is all there on the record, your sexual orgies. Listen to yourself, you filthy, abnormal animal. The American public, the church organizations that have been helping, Protestant, Catholic, and Jews, will know you for what you are, an evil, abnormal beast. So will others who've backed you. You are done. King, there's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You are done. There's but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. King immediately and correctly surmised that the FBI was behind the blackmail. Some have suggested that the "there's only one thing left for you to do" lines in the letter were urging King to decline the Nobel Peace Prize he was due to receive, or to step down from his leadership role in the civil rights movement, but King himself understood the letter to be urging him to commit suicide. It's hard to see how the FBI could have made good on their threats to disseminate the blackmail material to the public when it was so obviously a product of high-tech FBI-style spying. But either way, the tapes were never released and remain classified to this day. But even if the blackmail against Martin Luther King didn't achieve its objective, it's impossible to talk about sexual blackmail in American politics of the 20th century without addressing the man who was behind the letter to King, the longtime director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover ran the FBI from its founding in 1935 until his death in office in 1972, and he became one of the most powerful figures in the entire federal government during his tenure. Besides being the sole director of the biggest domestic espionage and law enforcement organization in the United States, Hoover maintained an extensive database of compromising material about politicians, journalists, and celebrities, gathered by FBI agents across the country, and kept in a safe in Hoover's office, which he used to consolidate his power through both blackmail and strategic leaks. During the presidential election of 1960 between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, Hoover decided to throw his weight behind the more conservative Nixon, slipping the Republican vice president his blackmail file on JFK's sexual indiscretions, including surveillance photographs the FBI had taken of him and his mistresses, and even tapes from bugs they'd planted in hotel rooms where JFK had consummated the affairs. Hoover's treachery was only revealed years later when the famous journalist Jack Anderson gave a TV interview in which he admitted that affiliates of the Nixon campaign had approached him and other journalists with the blackmail material, hoping to get it published in one of the big American newspapers before the election. Anderson accepted the dossier, but declined to publish it, picking up some details about Hoover's blackmail methods in the process. It was rather a friendly approach, pretending to be trying to protect the president. It would be something like, "There's some information that we've heard that your enemies might get, Mr. President, and we would like you to know we're helping to guard this information so that it won't get out." It was a way of letting the president know that J. Edgar Hoover also had that information. And then, when he needed an appropriation, wanted a presidential pardon, well, he always got them. I know how he operated. This characterization of Hoover's blackmail operation, that he approached politicians under the guise of a concerned friend looking to protect their reputation, was reiterated by Watergate burglar G. Gordon Liddy, whose FBI career included a stint at the division known as the Crime Records Department, which much of the blackmail material passed through on its way to Hoover. As Liddy recounted to Anthony Summers in the book Official and Confidential, "Say there was a bank robbery someplace. An informant might tell us the man to look for was holed up in the Skyline Motel, about 6 blocks south of the Capitol in Washington. Agents search the motel, and in the process, they come across Senator X in bed with Miss Lucy Schwarzkopf, age 15 and a half. They make their apologies and withdraw, but everything has to go into the record. The supervisor who gets the report may think there's no need to keep stuff on the peccadillos of Senator X, but he has no authority to destroy it. The report has to go up to the director's office. In Edgar's office," said Liddy, "a summary would be prepared for Miss Gardner of Crime Records. Those involved in congressional liaison, like Liddy himself, would come across it sooner or later. Say the director was expecting to meet Senator X, or if the senator's name had come up in some way, I would have to prepare a memorandum. I would check out the card held by Miss Gardner, and if there was something noteworthy, I would write a note, perhaps a blind memorandum, for the director only. It would say something like, "The director may wish to recall that Senator X was involved in such and such an incident and is not very discreet." Sometimes, said Liddy, Edgar might send an official to meet with the compromised politician soon after receiving the initial report. The messenger would simply say, "Mr. Hoover apologized for the intrusion into the senator's privacy. Assure him it came up in the course of legitimate inquiries, and tell him not to worry. This had been removed from the file." The whole point was to let the senator know that Hoover knew. That's why when Hoover would go before the Appropriations Committee and say he wanted something, they'd give him anything, because they were afraid of what he had. When it comes to proving who exactly Hoover blackmailed in this way, and to what ends, the majority of the evidence is almost certainly lost to history. Some of the most precise details that have appeared in the public record come from Anthony Summers's book, Official and Confidential. Emanuel Geller of Brooklyn, a Democratic congressman for 50 years, many of them as chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, told New York Post publisher Dorothy Schiff that he was afraid to speak his mind about Edgar's abuses because the FBI had a hold on him. In public, he continued to speak of Edgar as a most exemplary public servant. It was not uncommon, said veteran agent Arthur Murtaugh, to learn of some politically damaging information about some leading figure in politics as having been developed by the Bureau. And then, always at a time when it would be most damaging to the individual, the information would in some way show up in the Chicago Tribune or some other friend of the Bureau. Walter Troen, the Chicago Tribune reporter who was close to Edgar, recalled talking with some of the victims of such tactics. Some of Hoover's overwhelming support on the Hill was due to what I can only call blackmail, polite blackmail. Senator Sam Ervin, remembered for his presiding role during the Watergate hearings, behaved differently in 1971 when, as chairman for the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, he vetoed a probe of FBI abuses. "I think," he said of Edgar, "he has done a very good job in a difficult post." According to William Sullivan, Ervin was, quote, "in our pocket. It was financial, something like the Abe Fortas affair. This is why he came out praising the Bureau." Edgar liked to send dirt on politicians to the White House. "I know he had a dossier on me," recalled former Florida Senator George Smathers, "because Lyndon Johnson read it to me. Johnson called me in the middle of the night, he loved to do that, and said, 'These are rumors the FBI have been picking up about you.' He also read me the file on Senator Thurston Morton, the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, and the one on Barry Goldwater. There was a lot about Nixon in there, too. A lot of people were very nervous." The journalist Jack Anderson would later report that after Kennedy's electoral victory over Nixon in 1960, Hoover began feeding JFK compromising material about other politicians. The editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, related a conversation he'd had with Kennedy in which the president had said, "Boy, the dirt Hoover has on those senators, you wouldn't believe it." Another bizarre example of Hoover's monomaniacal obsession with collecting compromising material on his enemies concerns the premier JFK assassination conspiracy theorist of the 1960s, Mark Lane. Lane was a lawyer and activist who had been elected to the New York State Assembly as a left-wing representative of a district encompassing parts of Manhattan and East Harlem. After the assassination of President Kennedy, however, Lane would devote himself to the examination of the evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald full-time and attempted to insert himself into the proceedings of the Warren Commission as de facto defense counsel for the accused assassin. In 1966, 2 years after the original publication of the Warren Commission report, Lane would publish Rush to Judgment, the first major book to challenge the conclusions of the Warren Commission, which spent 29 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, launching his decades-long career as one of the most prominent critics of the official story of the JFK assassination. In 2017, as a result of the JFK Records Act, the FBI's files on Mark Lane were released, showing that contemporaneous with Lane's Warren Commission criticism, the FBI was hard at work collecting compromising information about his sex life. Among the disclosures was a 1964 FBI report detailing the contents of a 1962 interview with a woman named Phyllis Golden. According to the report, while being interviewed under subpoena for passing a bad check, Golden had told a New York district attorney that, quote, she had something to hold over Mark Lane for the rest of his life. Even though Mark Lane had absolutely nothing to do with the check fraud case that was the ostensible subject of the interview, the DA would spend considerable time pursuing this angle during her questioning. According to the FBI report, Golden said she had gone to Lane's apartment with another woman named Lee Stevens, where the three engaged in a series of bizarre sex acts. The first thing was Mr. Lane had his temperature taken. First, he undressed himself as far as the shorts were concerned. Then he laid face down on the bed, and I said, "You'll have to remove your jockey shorts too." And he took them down, and in that I assisted him. After that, I inserted a candle into Mark. After that, I tweezed some hair, and then Lee beat Mark with his own belt on the buttocks. Then pins were inserted around the area and into the Then he got an Both of us gave him the I believe I held the boy, and then I put it in, and then he started to after the was completely in him, and he wasn't supposed to relieve himself until after he meditated. But he claimed he had to relieve himself, and he did. Did he reach a climax? Yes, he did. It was at this point that Lee suggested taking the pictures, and I got the camera. One of the pictures showed Mark lying face down on the bed with the candle inserted. Another was taken of Lee beating him. Another was taken of Mr. Lane on his stomach, not only with the candle inserted, but also with 2 stems of artificial flowers. A fourth was taken of Lee singeing his hair around the temples with a lighted match. I show you a photograph and ask you if that's one of the pictures that you took. Yes. Whose picture is that? Mark Lane. A copy of this picture was obtained through extremely confidential means and is available only through the staff director. In January of 1962, when this interview occurred, Mark Lane was just a left-wing local New York politician. Kennedy wouldn't even be assassinated for almost 2 more years. It's unknown whether or not the FBI ever used this information as leverage over Mark Lane, but the declassified FBI file suggests that FBI agents were requesting copies of these documents at least as late as 1972. And it's extremely hard to imagine a legitimate law enforcement purpose for this some 10 years after the interview had taken place. And why was a New York district attorney interrogating a woman over a local politician's sexual preferences for a case that was ostensibly about check fraud anyway? The FBI report on the interrogation wasn't written until 1964, a full 2 years after the DA's Phyllis Golden interview had taken place, when Lane was already well known as a Warren Commission critic, and Lane was never charged with a crime. These documents would have been known to only a handful of people in the New York DA's office. So how did the FBI even learn of their existence, much less obtain copies of the photos? The report says that the DA couldn't have obtained them from either of the 2 women. So what were these extremely confidential means by which the DA's office came to possess the photos? And why would the FBI be collecting this kind of information about a prominent Warren Commission critic, if not for blackmail? According to the journalist Jack Anderson, the blackmail material in Hoover's office safe was destroyed immediately after his death, so the FBI report on Mark Lane is one of the few remaining primary source documents that shows the kind of compromising material Hoover was collecting on public figures. While there's overwhelming evidence that Hoover leveraged his extensive database of blackmail material about politicians, journalists, and celebrities to achieve his own objectives, there's also reason to believe that Hoover was likely a victim of sexual blackmail himself. Chronologically, the earliest allegations regarding blackmail in Hoover's career date to the late 1940s, during the power struggle to establish the CIA. In the wake of the Second World War, America's wartime foreign intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, was disbanded, and various proposals were circulating for the establishment of a permanent American foreign intelligence agency. Wild Bill Donovan, the former head of the OSS, was lobbying for the office to be reconstituted for peacetime operations under his own command, while Hoover vigorously opposed this, arguing that the FBI's mandate should just be expanded to cover international affairs. According to the book Wedge, The Secret War Between the FBI and CIA by Mark Riebling, Hoover's campaign against Donovan went beyond mere persuasion. There was a lingering suspicion that Hoover had collected dirt on Wild Bill Donovan and used it to keep him from becoming the CIA director. Old Donovan hands, like future CIA director Richard Helms, would allege that Hoover played a very skillful game with knowledge of the sexual habits of prominent people. Hoover was said to have spread the rumor that Donovan had contracted syphilis in orgies with prostitutes, while Donovan's men may have been the genesis of a mafia homosexual blackmail thesis advanced after Hoover's death. Notwithstanding any blackmail that may have taken place, neither man ultimately won the power struggle. President Truman would incorporate the CIA in 1947, with Rear Admiral Sidney Sewers as its first director, while Hoover remained FBI director, with the Bureau's jurisdiction limited to the United States. The same dynamic, Hoover blackmailing others while appearing to be blackmailed himself, would play out repeatedly throughout Hoover's career. Rumors of homosexuality and cross-dressing followed Hoover from his earliest days in government. He never married, and he lived with his best friend, confidant, and assistant at the FBI, Clyde Tolson, for decades, sparking rumors of a gay relationship. Hoover spent virtually all of his waking hours with Tolson, working with him at the FBI, eating lunch with him, and even vacationing with him. As reported in the book Official and Confidential, multiple witnesses came forward in the years after Hoover's death, claiming to have witnessed him holding hands or cuddling with Tolson. But these reports were 30-plus years old at the time they were published, making corroboration all but impossible. Hoover actively cultivated an image as a tough anti-communist crime fighter, but in private, he was personally corrupt, using FBI labor and resources to renovate his private residence, and developed a gambling habit that some have claimed grew into an addiction. Much of the speculation regarding Hoover's sexuality was grounded in the FBI's inexplicable reluctance to prosecute organized crime during Hoover's tenure. Famously, Hoover publicly denied that organized crime even existed in America during the heights of Prohibition-era gangsterism and mafia consolidation. which led to widespread rumors that elements of the mafia must have had some kind of leverage over Hoover. And in the years since his death, numerous gangsters with varying levels of credibility have claimed that the mafia had indeed used blackmail to neutralize Hoover and the FBI. In the book, Official and Confidential, powerful Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky's associate, Seymour Pollack, was quoted as saying, "Lansky had more than information on Hoover. He had page, chapter, and verse. One night, when we were sitting around in his apartment at the Rosita de Hornedo, we were talking about Hoover, and Meyer laughed and said, 'I fixed that son of a bitch, didn't I?' Lansky's fix, according to Pollack, also involved bribery, not of Edgar himself, but men close to him. The homosexual thing, said Pollack, was Hoover's Achilles heel. Meyer found it, and it was like he pulled strings with Hoover. He never bothered any of Meyer's people. As for Summers' source for these details, Seymour Pollack, there's precious little information in the public record about him, except for, ironically, an FBI memo identifying Pollack as an FBI informant on the mafia. But the fact that the Bureau apparently considered Pollack a legitimate source of information on Meyer Lansky's horse racing interests well before he became a source for Summers' book suggests that at the very least, Pollack could plausibly have been in a position to know the details of Lansky's blackmail of Hoover. According to the same book, in 1971, pro basketball player and Patriarchate crime family associate Irving Ash Resnick and an associate talked with the writer Pete Hamill in the Galleria bar at Caesar's Palace. They spoke of Meyer Lansky as a genius, the man who put everything together, and as the man who nailed J. Edgar Hoover. When I asked what they meant, Hamill recalled, they told me Lansky had some pictures of Hoover in some kind of gay situation with Clyde Tolson. Lansky was the guy who controlled the pictures, and he had made his deal with Hoover to lay off. That was the reason, they said, that for a long time they had nothing to fear from the FBI. The ultimate source for this story, Ash Resnick, was a pro basketball player who went on to spend 4 decades as a significant figure in the management of mob-controlled Las Vegas casinos. Resnick and Pollack were both mafia-connected and knew each other well, according to Summers. However, it's worth noting that even though Summers personally interviewed both men for his book, neither interview subject actually told Summers that they had personally seen evidence of blackmail. Pollack only said that Lansky was bribing Hoover's men, and that he knew homosexuality was Hoover's Achilles heel. And even though Summers interviewed Resnick himself, the only mention of Resnick having knowledge of sexual blackmail material comes from a third-hand account. Instead of quoting Resnick himself talking about seeing Lansky's blackmail photos of Hoover, Summers quotes the author Pete Hamill, who said he'd heard the story from Resnick at a dinner decades earlier. If Summers conducted his own interview with Resnick for the book, why didn't he just ask him about the Hoover photos himself? Is it really possible he just forgot to bring it up? Or did Pollack deny the story or give some other version, which Summers left out in favor of the more sensational third-hand account he got from Pete Hamill? The same quote appears in Whitney Webb's One Nation Under Blackmail, attributed to a former Lansky associate, rather than an author who interviewed a former Lansky associate, an unfortunate omission on Webb's part. Anthony Summers never tells us why he opted to print a third party's decades-old recollection of an anecdote from a dinner meeting with Resnick, rather than a first-hand quote from his interview with Resnick himself. But at the very least, these claims should be evaluated with this context in mind. The alleged photos of Hoover engaged in homosexual activity are a consistent theme in the historical accounts of Hoover's blackmail. In the book Official and Confidential, Summers quotes a former OSS officer named John Weitz, who claimed he'd attended a dinner party in the 1950s, at which the OSS veteran and top CIA official James Jesus Angleton had shown him a photo of Hoover engaging in a sex act with his assistant Clyde Tolson. After a conversation about Hoover, our host went to another room and came back with a photograph. It was not a good picture and was clearly taken from some distance away, but it showed 2 men apparently engaged in homosexual activity. Angleton said the men were Hoover and Tolson. The source for this anecdote was John Weitz, a wealthy Jewish refugee from Nazi-era Germany who worked for the OSS during the Second World War and went on to become a successful textile manufacturer, author, and race car driver in the United States. Given his OSS connections, it's entirely plausible that Weitz and Angleton at least knew each other, making this one of the more credible anecdotes of its kind. In a separate interview for the same book, a CIA contractor and electronics expert named Gordon Novel claimed that he too had been shown compromising photos of Hoover. What I saw was a picture of him giving Clyde Tolson a... There was more than one shot, but the startling one was a close shot of Hoover's head. He was totally recognizable. You could not see the face of the man he was with, but Angleton said it was Tolson. I asked him if they were fakes, but he said they were real, that they'd been taken with a special lens. They looked authentic to me. I was pursuing a lawsuit against New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, which Hoover wanted me to drop, but which my contacts in the Johnson administration and its CIA wanted me to pursue. I'd been told I would incur Hoover's wrath if I went ahead, but Angleton was demonstrating that Hoover was not invulnerable, that the agency had enough power to make him come to heel. I had the impression that this was not the first time the sex pictures had been used. Angleton told me to go see Hoover and tell him I'd seen the sex photographs. Later, I went to the Mayflower Hotel and spoke to Hoover. He was with Tolson, sitting in the rib room. When I mentioned that I had seen the sex photographs and that Angleton had sent me, Tolson nearly choked on his food. Hoover told me something like, "Get the hell out of here," and I did. Angleton told me the photographs had been taken around 1946, at the time they were fighting over foreign intelligence, which Hoover wanted but never got. Now, the source of the story, Gordon Novel, is an enigmatic figure with a strange and wildly varied background. He was involved in a burglary of a munitions bunker in Louisiana, which procured the guns that would be used in the Bay of Pigs invasion, a burglary which Novel insisted was approved by the CIA, after which he went on to open a marketing agency and a business selling wiretapping equipment while working as a private investigator. It was in this latter capacity that Novel was hired by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison as his security during Garrison's investigation of the Kennedy assassination. But Garrison would come to suspect that Novel was a CIA plant sent to sabotage his investigation, an insinuation which Novel himself seemed to encourage at times. There's no evidence in the public record explicitly proving that Novel was a CIA agent. However, he was verifiably connected to numerous known intelligence agents and operations, so an association with James Jesus Angleton is certainly within the realm of possibility. Whether this makes his claims about Hoover more or less credible is subject to interpretation. It's notable that both Weitz and Novel claim to have been shown the photos of Hoover by the same man, James Jesus Angleton, a CIA counterintelligence chief, who knew both Richard Helms and Wild Bill Donovan. On the other hand, it's also worth noting the discrepancies between Weitz and Novel's descriptions of the photos they claim to have seen. For Weitz, it was a single photo, quote, "not a good picture," clearly taken from some distance away, and he says Angleton told him it was of Hoover and Tolson, implying that the photo wasn't clear enough that their identities would be obvious, whereas Novel said there was more than one photo, including a, quote, "startling close shot of Hoover's head, taken with a special lens, in which Hoover was totally recognizable." From their descriptions, it seems unlikely that Weitz and Novel saw the same photo, but Weitz's story takes place in the 1950s, while Novel's happens in 1967, meaning that if both stories are true, the CIA may have been spying on Hoover well into the 50s or 60s. This discrepancy also has implications for the Mafia connection. If the CIA and Meyer Lansky's criminal organization both had compromising photos of Hoover, it raises the question, was it the same set of photos? Because if it was, that suggests that the CIA was passing information to organized crime, or vice versa. Is it really possible that there was more than one set of blackmail photos of Hoover in circulation, one obtained by Lansky and one from the CIA? And could this explain the differences in Weitz and Novel's descriptions of the photos? Whatever Lansky was doing, it appears to have worked, because despite decades of flagrant lawbreaking and extensive FBI surveillance, Lansky was able to run his criminal enterprise free from serious prosecution for almost the entire duration of Hoover's tenure as FBI director. And these weren't the only compromising photos of Hoover that had allegedly made it into the Mafia's hands. According to mobster Bill Bonanno's autobiography, Bound by Honor, whom can we count on as a friend? Roy Cohn mentioned J. Edgar Hoover, but I said that Hoover no longer seemed reliable to me or to anyone else. He waved a hand. "You know how many FBI agents are assigned to organized crime? About half a dozen," he said. "I was as aware as anyone that for years Hoover had followed a hands-off policy towards us. But times had changed," I told Cohn. "Anyone could see that. Ever since Valachi, Hoover, like everyone else, had had to go along with the tide. He hates Bobby," Cohn said matter-of-factly. "You know, he still won't use the term mafia. He has an active professional stake in believing there's no such thing. Want to show you guys something," he said, getting up from his huge desk and strutting into another room, from which he returned in a moment carrying a manila folder. "Ever see these?" he said, untying the stay and removing a batch of photos. There were 7 or 8 of them. Most were 5x7 shots, a couple were 8x10 photos. They were all pictures of Hoover in women's clothing. His face was daubed with lipstick and makeup, and he wore a wig of ringlets. In several of the photos, he posed alone, smiling, even mugging for the camera. In a few other photos, he was sitting on the lap of an unidentified male, stroking his cheek in one, hugging him in another, holding a morsel of food before his mouth in yet another. "Louis," meaning Louis Rosenstiel, took most of these, Cohn said, at a party on a houseboat in the Keys, 1948, 1949, I think. There are 1 or 2 others taken earlier, maybe in the 30s. Who knows? Hoover knows about these, believe me. He's always been aware of what would happen if they ever got out. Now, to be clear, this is the same Bill Bonanno autobiography discussed earlier, the one that was derided by critics upon its release for, among other things, suggesting that JFK had actually been assassinated by the mobster Johnny Rosselli, who'd fired the fatal shot while hiding in a storm drain underneath Dealey Plaza. And Bonanno himself had multiple felony convictions by the time the book was published, including mail fraud and defrauding senior citizens, so his claim should be considered within the context of his questionable reliability as a witness. On the other hand, Bonanno wasn't the only one claiming to have seen evidence of blackmail between Roy Cohn, Louis Rosenstiel, and Hoover. And in fact, this relationship was one of the most consistent themes in the testimony of witnesses who said the Mafia had blackmailed Hoover. Roy Cohn was a deeply closeted homosexual lawyer, later disbarred, and political fixer who rose to prominence as one of the mid-20th century's preeminent red baiters, prosecuting the nuclear spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets, and working under Senator Joe McCarthy to expose suspected communists in what came to be known as the Second Red Scare. After McCarthy's fall from grace, Cohn remained a fixture in conservative politics, maintaining relationships with figures like Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump, among others, while working as a lawyer and ruthless political operative. In the 1960s, Cohn was repeatedly charged with serious felonies, including extortion, blackmail, bribery, securities fraud, conspiracy, and witness tampering, winning acquittals in every case. Cohn was simultaneously deeply enmeshed in the New York City underworld, acting as a lawyer and consultant for various mobsters, at the same time that he was advising multiple powerful Republican politicians, former CIA Director William Casey, and then New York Mayor Abraham Beame, among others, until 1986, when Cohn was finally disbarred for stealing from clients and falsifying records, dying later that same year from AIDS. Louis Rosenstiel, on the other hand, was an extremely wealthy, mafia-affiliated businessman who'd made his fortune in the liquor business in the wake of Prohibition. In his forward-facing biographical claims, Rosenstiel said that he'd had a hunch in the early 1930s that Prohibition was coming to an end, so he'd opportunistically invested in the infrastructure to mass-produce and distribute different types of alcoholic drinks before the ban was lifted, putting himself in position to corner the market once Prohibition ended. Then, when the 18th Amendment was repealed, Rosenstiel's bet paid off, making him one of the biggest players in the nascent American alcohol industry, and he would later consolidate his various business holdings under the name Schenley Industries. It's been widely speculated that given Rosenstiel's mafia connections, the story about buying abandoned distilleries and alcohol production equipment was probably self-mythologizing, and rather than sitting around waiting for Prohibition to end, Rosenstiel had really started out bootlegging liquor for the mafia in the Northeast, and simply continued these operations when they became legal. But regardless of the true source of Rosenstiel's wealth, it is beyond dispute that he was at the very least on friendly terms with both the mafia and J. Edgar Hoover, attending parties with the FBI director, hiring his underlings for jobs at his company, and even donating $1 million to establish the J. Edgar Hoover Foundation, while simultaneously maintaining deep connections with organized crime. Roy Cohn was perhaps even closer to Hoover, consulting him for advice when he was a lawyer at the Justice Department, and attending private celebrations in Hoover's honor. Hoover was the one who had recommended Cohn when Senator McCarthy was looking for a chief counsel for his hearings on communist subversion, and the two remained both political allies and private friends. Although the stories about Cohn and Rosenstiel being involved in blackmail against Hoover have come from multiple witnesses with varying levels of credibility, the substance of the accusations remained largely consistent regardless of who was telling the story. Essentially, Rosenstiel and Cohn were both gay, or at least bisexual, with extensive social networks and underworld contacts in New York, where they would throw gay male orgies with very young prostitutes. After insinuating themselves into Hoover's social circle, they invited him to these orgies at a location called the Blue Suite in New York's Plaza Hotel, and made sure photos were taken depicting Hoover in compromising positions. Rosenstiel's own house was extensively bugged, so that conversations virtually anywhere in the house could be recorded by the home's audio surveillance system. And it's been widely speculated that Rosenstiel may have rigged the Blue Suite with similar recording devices, though this remains unproven. The photographs, which, depending on who you ask, showed Hoover dressed in women's clothing or engaged in sex acts with young men, including Clyde Tolson, were then either passed on to the mobster Meyer Lansky or used by Cohn himself to blackmail Hoover into covering for the mafia or to extract political favors. Perhaps the most complete account of the Cohn-Rosenstiel blackmail ring appears in the first volume of Whitney Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, in which she presents witness accounts from 3 different people as evidence of the blackmail ring's existence: New York attorney John Klotz, ex-NYPD detective James Rothstein, and Louis Rosenstiel's ex-wife, Susan Rosenstiel Kaufman. John Klotz, the New York lawyer, allegedly became privy to information about the blackmail ring when he was retained by a former client and lover of Roy Cohn's in the early 1980s to defend him against harassment charges initiated by Cohn. As part of his defense strategy, Klotz hired private investigators to look into Cohn's personal life, and according to Klotz, as quoted in the book Bobby and J. Edgar by Burton Hirsch, his investigators discovered gay orgies hosted by Cohn where powerful men could mingle with young prostitutes at a hotel in New York. Roy Cohn was providing protection. There were a bunch of pedophiles involved. That's where Cohn got his power from: blackmail. This quotation appears in both the Hirsch and Webb books, but unfortunately, neither of them tell us what exactly Klotz saw that led him to this conclusion. To be fair, in the actual quotes we have from Klotz, he did not explicitly claim to have seen any blackmail material himself. According to Hirsch, it was Klotz investigators who unearthed evidence in the course of their criminal defense work that implicated Cohn in the blackmail operation. So Klotz may be a reputable lawyer and reliable as witnesses go, but we still don't know what it was that he saw exactly, and without more details, it appears he was still at best 2 degrees removed from seeing any actual proof of blackmail. The next witness cited by Webb is the retired NYPD detective James Rothstein. According to Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, further confirmation of Rosensteel's and Cohn's activities in the Blue Suite, later determined to be Suite 233, comes from statements made by Cohn himself to former NYPD detective and ex-head of the department's Human Trafficking and Vice-Related Crimes Division, James Rothstein. Rothstein later told John DeCamp, a former Nebraska state senator who investigated the Franklin scandal of the 1980s, that Cohn had admitted to being part of a sexual blackmail operation targeting politicians with minors during a sit-down interview with the former detective. Rothstein told DeCamp the following about Cohn. Cohn's job was to run the little boys. Say you had an admiral, a general, a congressman who did not want to go along with the program. Cohn's job was to set them up, then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself. Rothstein later told Paul David Collins, a former journalist turned researcher, that Cohn had also identified the sexual blackmail operation as being part of the anti-communist crusade of the time. Rothstein confirmed his statements to both DeCamp and Collins in an interview with Whitney Webb that was conducted in early 2020. He additionally told Webb that Cohn had told him that his role in this ring had originally come about because he himself had been entrapped and blackmailed, leading Rothstein to feel some sort of sympathy for Cohn. Now, you may have noticed that even though Webb mentions John DeCamp and Paul David Collins in this section, every actual claim of fact being made is ultimately sourced from one person, James Rothstein. She quotes John DeCamp quoting Rothstein, she quotes Paul David Collins quoting Rothstein, and then she paraphrases stuff Rothstein told her himself in an interview she conducted with him. There's no indication that Rothstein presented any physical or documentary evidence to any of these authors, so ultimately, we're essentially taking Rothstein at his word here, that he's remembering things accurately and reporting them truthfully. But there are a few reasons for skepticism. According to Rothstein, Roy Cohn, the politically sophisticated lawyer and criminal who by all accounts was advising CIA executives, future presidents, and mobsters about legal matters, while regularly getting away with all kinds of criminal activity for decades, spontaneously broke down within hours of meeting Rothstein, and for some unknown reason, told him, "Oh yeah, by the way, I've been trafficking children to be abused by politicians and generals because I'm illegally blackmailing them to fight communism, but also I'm only doing it because I myself was blackmailed in a similar way, because, oh yeah, I almost forgot to tell you, I'm actually gay and also a pedophile, officer." In the nearly 50 years since Roy Cohn's death, not a single other person who knew Cohn has publicly claimed that he ever confessed anything like this to him. Not his family, not his friends, lovers, co-workers, acquaintances, no one. Is it really plausible that Roy Cohn, the savvy, slick-talking lawyer, would confess to blackmail and child trafficking only once, for the first time, to a man he'd just met, who happened to be an NYPD cop of all things? Does that sound realistic? To answer that, it might be helpful to know, who is this James Rothstein character exactly? Well, it does appear to be true that he was an NYPD detective who worked on the Vice Squad for a period, and was at least marginally involved in some high-profile cases. Luckily for us, he's recorded hours of interviews where he discusses his entire career, some of which is actually corroborated by contemporaneous news articles. For example, in 1977, Rothstein arrested the Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis for trying to break into a woman's apartment. The fact that the arrest happened is beyond dispute. It was reported at the time by local media that Rothstein made the arrest, and he testified in Sturgis's case, which was ultimately dropped. But decades later, Rothstein started telling interviewers that once he was arrested, Sturgis began spontaneously confessing his secret involvement in the JFK assassination. According to Rothstein, Sturgis admitted that he was actually in Dealey Plaza the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and in fact, he was the long-hypothesized second shooter firing at Kennedy from the grassy knoll. To put this in context, Sturgis was indeed a CIA-connected mercenary involved in gun running and guerrilla warfare in Cuba, and after his arrest in the Watergate case in 1972, he was publicly accused of involvement in the JFK assassination from multiple angles, with some suspecting that he was one of the three tramps in the famous photo from Dealey Plaza, and others believing he had met with Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination. But Rothstein didn't make his accusations publicly until decades after the arrest, when the rumor of Frank Sturgis being in Dealey Plaza was already an entrenched part of JFK lore. Rothstein also claims that he was the investigator who uncovered the information that exposed the Franklin Credit Union scandal. Then, while working on the Franklin scandal, he began investigating the Johnny Gosch disappearance, and a group of CIA agents joined him to work on the Gosch case. But according to Rothstein, the CIA intentionally derailed the investigation by appointing a pedophile as their lead agent on the case, who was soon arrested for abusing children, causing the case to implode. Just to be clear, the CIA does not investigate missing person cases, much less on American soil, and there's no evidence they've ever been involved in the Johnny Gosch case in any capacity. Rothstein has also said that William Colby, the retired CIA director who died on his boat on a river near his house, was actually murdered because he was about to reveal the truth about the blackmail ring that had trafficked Johnny Gosch. Rothstein further claims that while working as a detective for the NYPD, Pope John Paul I personally asked him to investigate corruption in the Vatican Bank, and Rothstein soon discovered that the Pope was secretly gay and being blackmailed. And when the Pope died just a few days later, Rothstein learned that he had not suffered a heart attack, as was widely reported, but rather he had actually been poisoned by Joseph Ratzinger, the cardinal who would go on to become Pope years later. Just like his story about Roy Cohn's blackmail ring, the only evidence for any of these claims is Rothstein's testimony. And even then, he never mentioned any of the stuff publicly until decades after the events in question. There's no evidence whatsoever that Rothstein was involved in investigating the Franklin scandal or the Vatican Bank, besides his word. No news articles from the time, no government documents, no case notes that anyone's ever seen, nothing. In fact, John DeCamp even interviewed Rothstein for his book on the Franklin scandal, called The Franklin Cover-Up, but Rothstein is only quoted in the book anonymously in relation to Roy Cohn's alleged blackmail ring. If Rothstein was really so involved in the discovery of the Franklin scandal, why would John DeCamp, the primary authority on the Franklin case, neglect to mention this in a book in which he interviews Rothstein? If he was so central to the Franklin investigation, wouldn't DeCamp have at least named Rothstein in the book instead of just anonymously quoting him one time about a different case? To be clear, I think Whitney Webb's choice to present Rothstein's accusations about Roy Cohn without the context of Rothstein's larger biographical claims is irresponsible, bordering on dishonest. The likelihood that Roy Cohn randomly confessed to Detective Rothstein about running a child trafficking operation the day he met him is already low. The probability that Rothstein was getting calls from the blackmailed gay Pope while solving the JFK assassination, uncovering the Franklin scandal, sussing out pedo CIA agents, and unraveling Roy Cohn's blackmail ring seems astronomical. And unfortunately, this wasn't the only cause for skepticism in Whitney Webb's footnotes. In the section of One Nation Under Blackmail discussing Meyer Lansky's possible blackmail of Hoover, we find the passage, Meyer Lansky's widow also later claimed that her husband had acquired, quote, hard proof of Hoover's homosexuality and used it to neutralize the FBI as a threat to his own operations. The citation Webb provides for this quote leads us to source number 59, a book called Conspiracy in Camelot, The Complete History of the Assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy by a guy named Jerome Croth. The passage websites can be found on page 233. But if we go to page 233 and look at the section containing the quote, we find citation number 59 from Jerome Croth, telling us he got that quote from the Anthony Summers book, Official and Confidential. Now, Whitney Webb cites Official and Confidential repeatedly throughout her book, including multiple times in that very same chapter. That's weird. Why would Whitney Webb quote from this Jerome Croth guy's book if Jerome Croth was saying that he had sourced the quote from another book that's already on Webb's list of citations? Well, according to Croth, he got that quote from page 213 of Official and Confidential. Let's see what that page says. Oh, I guess that's why she didn't cite the original. Croth had attributed this statement to Meyer Lansky's wife and put it in quotation marks, as if it was a direct quote of something she actually said, but the actual passage he was citing isn't in quotation marks and doesn't even mention Meyer Lansky's wife at all. Instead of Lansky's wife, Summers attributes the claim to, quote, other information, not a specific person. Webb cites Official and Confidential dozens of times in her book. She must have been aware of this discrepancy. So why print the book like this? Why quote from Jerome Croth, quoting Anthony Summers, when you can just quote Anthony Summers himself? Why make it look like the quote came from Meyer Lansky's wife, when she must have known that it wasn't a direct quote, and Lansky's wife wasn't even the source of that information? Did she think it would sound more authoritative if the quote was attributed to Lansky's wife? Whatever the case, it's hard to imagine how this could have happened accidentally. The very next sentence of Webb's book says, the photos showed Hoover engaged in sexual activity, specifically oral sex, with his longtime friend, FBI Director Clyde Tolson, and directs us to endnote number 60 as the source for this information. But if we go to the UPI story that number 60 links to, it doesn't say that Hoover had specifically oral sex with Clyde Tolson, and in fact, oral sex isn't mentioned in the article at all. Whitney Webb also wrote a series of articles for the website Unlimited Hangout, summarizing and elaborating on her research from One Nation Under Blackmail. In her article, Government by Blackmail, Jeffrey Epstein, Trump's Mentor, and the Dark Secrets of the Reagan Era, Webb posits a connection between Roy Cohn's alleged blackmail ring, the public relations man Robert Keith Gray, and the CIA, writing, quote, It was later revealed by former Nebraska State Senator turned investigator John DeCamp that Robert Keith Gray was a specialist in homosexual blackmail operations for the CIA and was reported to have collaborated with Roy Cohn in those activities. But what is the evidence for these assertions? The only citation Webb provides is a hyperlink that leads to a PDF copy of John DeCamp's book, The Franklin Cover-Up. Webb doesn't specify a page number, but if we search DeCamp's book for Gray and Cohn's names in relation to blackmail and cross-reference the claim with a similar passage from Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, it turns up only one possible candidate from pages 178 and 179. Quote, Gray's own sexual proclivities were the subject of an article in the July-August 1982 issue of The Deep Backgrounder, titled Reagan Inaugural Co-Chairman, Powerful Closet Homosexual. The Deep Backgrounder tabloid featured exposés of homosexual networks in Washington, D.C. Its contributing editor was a former senior CIA official named Victor Marchetti. During the Watergate era, Robert Keith Gray served on the board of Consultants International, founded by CIA agent Edwin Wilson. When Wilson and fellow agent Frank Turple got caught running guns abroad, Gray tried to deny his connection with Wilson. Yet 10 years before, according to Peter Moss's book, Manhunt, in a top-secret Navy review of Wilson's intelligence career, Gray described Wilson as a person of unqualified trust with whom he'd been in contact professionally 2 or 3 times a month since 1963. Author Jim Hogan, in Secret Agenda, reported another aspect of Wilson's work for the CIA. According to fugitive ex-CIA officer Frank Turple, CIA-directed sexual blackmail operations were intensive in Washington at about the time of the Watergate scandal. One of those operations, Turple claims, was run by his former partner, Ed Wilson. In a letter to the author, Turple explained that historically, one of Wilson's agency jobs was to subvert members of both houses of Congress by any means necessary. Certain people could be easily coerced by living out their sexual fantasies in the flesh. A remembrance of these occasions was permanently recorded via selected cameras. Gray's associate, Wilson, was apparently continuing the work of a reported collaborator of Gray from the 1950s, McCarthy Committee counsel Roy Cohn, now dead of AIDS. According to the former head of the Vice Squad for one of America's biggest cities, Cohn's job was to run the little boys. Say you had an admiral, a general, a congressman who didn't want to go along with the program. Cohn's job was to set them up, then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself. Now, remember the claim that's supposedly being proven was, quote, Robert Keith Gray was a specialist in homosexual blackmail operations for the CIA and was reported to have collaborated with Roy Cohn in those activities. But what evidence do we actually have here? Well, if that last quote sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact same quote we covered earlier from ex-NYPD detective James Rothstein. So, ultimately, our evidence is that Robert Keith Gray worked with a guy who was accused of involvement in sexual blackmail by the gun-running, fugitive ex-CIA agent Frank Turple, which hardly makes Gray himself an expert in blackmail, plus a single quote from James Rothstein, who claims to have been involved in every conspiracy from the JFK assassination to the Franklin scandal to the Vatican Bank, and an article alleging that Robert Keith Gray was a closeted homosexual from some tabloid called The Deep Backgrounder. And just what was this Deep Backgrounder tabloid anyway? Well, according to a contemporaneous article from Harper's Magazine, Deep Backgrounder was a newsletter dedicated to outing supposedly closeted politicians published by the Holocaust-denying white nationalist group, the Liberty Lobby. In fact, the very same issue of the Deep Backgrounder that accused Robert Keith Gray of being gay also carried a story about a Senate page from Arkansas named Leroy Williams Jr., who said he'd had gay sex with 3 congressmen and procured gay prostitutes for others. But Williams later admitted he'd made up the whole story because he was being investigated for stealing another page's car. Is this evidence sufficient to establish the claim that Robert Keith Gray not only specialized in homosexual blackmail, but that he did so for the CIA in collaboration with Roy Cohn? Well, ultimately, that's up to you, but I have to admit, I'm skeptical. And I hate to have to say it, but this became somewhat of a pattern when delving into Whitney Webb's work. I'd come across a claim that I wanted more information about, check the footnotes, and then discover that the original document she cited was vague, or presented misleadingly, or missing context that totally changed the meaning of the text she had cited. As I said in the beginning of the video, my goal here is to lay out the evidence as clearly and neutrally as possible, so you can decide for yourself what to believe. But doing so requires presenting all relevant data points, regardless of their effect on any one individual's preferred overarching narrative. But that still leaves one more witness to Cohn's blackmail ring, the one who provided probably the most thorough and convincing testimony of all, whose claims set off a firestorm of controversy when they became public. Louis Rosensteel's ex-wife, Susan Rosensteel, aka Susan Kaufman. Although it's been cited by every serious work on the topic of the last 30 years, including Webb's book, Susan Rosensteel's testimony was first published in 1993 in Anthony Summers's book about Hoover, Official and Confidential. Susan was Louis Rosensteel's fourth wife, who married him at the height of his wealth and power, and personally witnessed his interactions with mobsters, including Meyer Lansky. According to Susan, her ex-husband's relationship with Hoover was more extensive than had been previously reported. Hoover frequently flew on Rosensteel's private plane and placed bets on horse races through Rosensteel, where if Hoover won, Rosensteel would pay out, but if he lost, the debt was forgiven immediately. In return, Rosensteel would lean on Hoover to put in a good word with judges when he was involved in litigation or needed an associate freed from jail. Hoover also helped Rosensteel with lobbying efforts. By Susan's telling, Rosensteel hired Hoover's influence man on Capitol Hill, Lewis Nichols, to help secure a change in alcohol tax laws that would save his company some $45 million. Susan claimed she was present at a meeting in New York between Hoover and Rosensteel, Roy Cohn, and their associates, at which Hoover helped coordinate the bribes that would be paid to sitting congressmen, including the notoriously corrupt Senator Lyndon Johnson and Representative Emanuel Seller, for successfully shepherding the bill through both houses of Congress. But her most scandalous revelations were about attending Roy Cohn's orgies in the Blue Suite at the Plaza Hotel with her husband and J. Edgar Hoover. Susan Rosensteel's previous marriage had collapsed because her first husband was predominantly homosexual. Now, she concluded, she had made a similar mistake. Louis Rosensteel seemed little interested in having sex with her, but went to great expense to have her dress up in clothes that made her look like a little girl. She discovered, meanwhile, that he enjoyed sex with men. One day, Susan recalled, I came into my husband's bedroom and found him in bed with Roy Cohn. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning. I was shocked, just shocked. He made some sort of joke about it being so he could be alone with his attorney. And I said, I've never seen Governor Dewey in bed with you, because Dewey was one of his attorneys too. And I walked out. Sometime in 1958, probably in the spring, Rosensteel asked his wife whether, while living in Paris with her previous husband, she had ever witnessed an orgy. A few weeks later, when Cohn was there, he commented that I was a regular and knew what life was, that my first husband had been gay, and I must have understood because I'd stayed with him for 9 years. And they said, how would I like to go to a party at the Hotel Plaza? But if it ever got out, it would be the most terrible thing in the world, I told them. If you want to go, I'll go, Cohn said. You're in for a big surprise. A few days later, Rosensteel took his wife to the Plaza, the venerable hotel overlooking New York's Central Park. They entered through a side entrance and took an elevator to a suite on the second or third floor. She had the impression her husband had been there before. He knocked, Susan recalled, and Roy Cohn opened the door. It was a beautiful suite, one of their biggest, all done in light blue. Hoover was there already, and I couldn't believe what I saw. According to Mrs. Rosensteel, Edgar was dressed up as a woman, in full drag. He was wearing a fluffy black dress, very fluffy, with flounces, and lace stockings and high heels, and a black curly wig. He had makeup on, and false eyelashes. It was a very short skirt, and he was sitting there in the living room of the suite with his legs crossed. Roy introduced him to me as Mary, and he replied, good evening, brusque, like the first time I'd met him. It was obvious he wasn't a woman. You could see where he'd shaved. It was Hoover. You've never seen anything like it. I couldn't believe it, that I should see the head of the FBI dressed as a woman. I think it was about then that Roy muttered to me that Hoover didn't know that I knew who he was, that I'd think he was someone else. I certainly didn't address him the way I had at other times, as Mr. Hoover. I was afraid of my life by then. The next thing, a couple of boys come in, young blonde boys, I'd say about 18 or 19, and then Roy makes the signal we should go into the bedroom. It was a tremendous bedroom, with a bed like in Caesar's time, with a damask spread, blue, I think, like the suite. And they go into the bedroom, and Hoover takes off his lace dress and pants, and under the dress he was wearing a little short garter belt. He lies on the double bed, and the two boys work on him with their hands. One of them wore rubber gloves. Then Rosensteel got into the act with the boys. I thought, you disgusting old man. Hoover and Cohn were watching, enjoying it. Then Cohn runs to get himself satisfied, full sex, with the two boys. Those poor boys. He couldn't get enough, but Hoover only had them, playing with him. Rosensteel would not discuss Edgar's part in the evening's events, but Cohn later laughed about it. He said, that was really something, wasn't it, with Mary Hoover? A year later, according to Susan, Rosensteel asked her to accompany him to the Plaza again. She agreed in return for an expensive pair of earrings from Harry Winston's, and the procedure was the same as on the previous occasion. Cohn ushered them into a suite to find Edgar, again attired in female finery. His clothing this time was even more outlandish. He had a red dress on, Susan recalled, and a black feather boa around his neck. He was dressed like an old flapper, like you see on old tin types. After about half an hour, some boys came, like before. This time they're dressed in leather, and Hoover had a Bible. He wanted one of the boys to read from the Bible. And he read, I forget which passage, and the other boy played with him, wearing the rubber gloves. And then Hoover grabbed the Bible, threw it down, and told the second boy to join in the sex. Susan Rosenstiel has insisted she could not possibly have been mistaken, that Edgar was definitely the man in the female dress at the plaza. Her account remained consistent, and she signed a sworn affidavit that it is true. She was permitted to witness Edgar and the others in such a situation, she surmised, because they wanted a woman present. I guess it gave them some sort of extra thrill. And if I'd said anything, they'd have said I was crazy, that Hoover hadn't been there. It would have been my word against theirs, and no one would have believed it. People who know Rosenstiel say he was bisexual. Roy Cohn was indeed homosexual and regularly hired young male prostitutes. The facts of Edgar's life, meanwhile, fit the plaza scenario well enough. He regularly traveled to New York City, and without Clyde. Former agent John Dixon, who served in New York during that period, often had the task of meeting Edgar when he arrived at Penn Station after traveling alone from Washington. He would be taken by car to the Waldorf, his usual hotel, and then left to his own devices. Sexual adventuring was folly for Edgar, and especially in the company of a man like Rosenstiel. Several sources told the New York Crime Committee that Rosenstiel had his Manhattan home wired from roof to basement with hidden microphones so that he could spy on visitors and staff. The man who installed the system, security consultant Fred Otash, said it was rigged to tape conversations for hours on end. Conversations in the library, where Edgar met with Rosenstiel and his cronies, were recorded as a matter of routine. The millionaire was quite capable of having the sex sessions at the plaza bugged or arranging for Edgar to be photographed in his female costumes. Meyer Lansky, who claimed Edgar was no threat, that he had been fixed, was Rosenstiel's close associate. Mrs. Rosenstiel quoted her husband as saying that because of Lansky and those people, we can always get Hoover to help us. The mobster's insurance policy, according to associates, was photographic evidence of Edgar's homosexual activity. The evidence suggests that in the late 50s, at a difficult time for the mob, the episodes at the plaza may have renewed that insurance. In the second edition of Official and Confidential, the author Anthony Summers added some additional sourcing that he discovered after the first edition had already been published. Susan Rosenstiel mentioned to me that she had once possessed a photograph of Hoover in the company of her husband's mobster friends. That she did have such evidence was confirmed following publication of this book by Mary Nichols of the Philadelphia Inquirer, who met Mrs. Rosenstiel years ago. She did have suitcases of photographs that she had hauled away from her marriage to Louis Rosenstiel, Nichols recalled. The ones I saw showed Hoover, lawyer Roy Cohn, and Rosenstiel at all sorts of social events with mobsters. It's worth noting that Rosenstiel's connections to organized crime were not widely known until they were revealed in New York state government hearings in the early 1970s, right before Hoover's death. So appearing in public with Rosenstiel wouldn't have been cause for scandal at the time Hoover did it. And to be clear, Susan didn't even explicitly say that she had personal knowledge of Hoover being blackmailed, even if she quotes her husband implying as much with his reference to Meyer Lansky, quote, fixing Hoover. Specifically, Susan says that she saw Hoover cross-dressing while engaging in bizarre homosexual acts and directly participating in flagrant corruption, including the bribery of congressmen, while Susan's journalist friend testified to seeing compromising, though not sexual, photos of Hoover with Roy Cohn and several mobsters. But when it comes to blackmail specifically, Susan makes no claim to having seen anything herself. Since Susan was the most persuasive of Anthony Summers' witnesses, with the most inflammatory story, the sections of Official and Confidential detailing her claims provoked the most vociferous pushback upon release. Typical of the criticism was that found in the journal article Queer Hoover, Sex, Lies, and Political History by the author Claire Bond Potter. For one thing, historians and respectable journalists usually rely on corroborated evidence. Furthermore, despite the fact that rumors of Hoover's homosexuality had circulated in print from the moment he became director in 1926, there is reason to doubt Susan's credibility and Summers' use of her as a source. The facts of her life suggest that Susan, reduced to an impoverished old age, may have invented an outlandish tale in a search for revenge, profit, and fame. In 2002, journalist Ronald Kessler, in his book Secrets of the FBI, summarized the doubts also raised by others when he noted that Hoover had provided damaging information about Susan during the Rosenstiel's divorce in the late 1960s. That Susan had testified for the government against Lewis and his organized crime associates, but had been convicted and served a prison term for perjury in 1971. And that her fall from wealth and status may have made her a willing accomplice to the lowest kind of journalism. When he found her living in a single-room occupancy hotel in New York, Kessler wrote, Susan freely admitted that Summers had paid for interviews and paid her again not to talk until his book was out. She had subsequently been paid by Frontline and the BBC to participate in television documentaries. Like most journalists and news organizations, Kessler commented, I believe that paying for information calls into question its credibility. Anthony Summers responded to many of these charges in the second edition of Official and Confidential. About Susan Rosenstiel's perjury charge, Summers says the following. Hoover defenders maintained that Mrs. Rosenstiel was not a credible source because she pleaded guilty to an attempted perjury charge in 1971. I told readers this, but unlike the critics, also explained the context. The very week the charge was brought, the New York State Legislative Committee on Crime had planned to produce Mrs. Rosenstein as a witness to her husband's links to the mafia. The committee's chairman and chief counsel were outraged at the perjury development. The perjury charge was brought in connection with a 1969 civil suit, a move lawyers considered unprecedented and bizarre. Committee officials believed it was instigated by Rosenstein himself, using his vast wealth and influence to obstruct the official inquiry by discrediting his former wife. Court records show the tycoon had used similar tactics in the recent past to pervert the course of justice. So, to be clear, in 1971, the week Susan Rosenstein was going to testify to the New York State Legislature about her wealthy husband's mafia connections, she was hit with perjury charges related to a civil suit she'd been involved in 2 years prior. This move by prosecutors was described as unprecedented and bizarre because typically, perjury charges would be pressed immediately after the perjured testimony, not at random 2 years later, which gave the appearance that the charges were retaliation for her planned testimony to the legislature. The omission of these facts by the supposed debunkers seems irresponsible at best. Later in Queer Hoover, Potter admits, quote, when contacted 10 years after Official and Confidential came out by the journalist Ronald Kessler, who promised that she would be famous again if she admitted that she made up the cross-dressing story, she insisted that it did happen. While Kessler finds the story to be outlandish, that the post-war rumors were probably generated by one of Hoover's political enemies in the CIA, and that Hoover simply could not have engaged in such activity at the plaza with a number of witnesses present without having it leak out. He also cites the very respectable assertion by Elliott Roosevelt, son of President Franklin D. and Eleanor, that his father knew about Hoover's homosexuality in the 1930s, but did not feel it was grounds for removing him from his directorship of the FBI, so long as his abilities were not impaired. Another critic, Alan Theo Harris, points out in his book, J. Edgar Hoover, Sex and Crime, that Hoover was well aware of the gay rumors about him, and on multiple occasions sent FBI employees to interrogate and intimidate random citizens who had been reported to the FBI for merely gossiping about Hoover's sexuality. In one case, the FBI received information that a Cleveland woman had told members of her bridge club that she'd heard a rumor that Hoover was gay, and the FBI sent a senior official to interrogate her, making her promise that at her next bridge club meeting, she would, quote, point out to each of those present that her statement was not founded on fact and that she was deeply sorry. There were similar incidents involving a woman at a beauty parlor in Washington, D.C., and a businessman in New York. The FBI agent who met with the businessman threatened that if he ever called Hoover gay again, the agent would, quote, finish him right there on the spot. In other words, murder him. These events were documented in contemporaneous FBI reports by the agents themselves, so there's no question that Hoover was jealously guarding his reputation from gay rumors. It's worth pointing out that there's no indication in the text of Official and Confidential that Anthony Summers ever explicitly asked Susan, was your husband, Roy Cohn, or their associates blackmailing J. Edgar Hoover, and how do you know? The closest we get is Susan quoting her ex-husband, saying, quote, because of Lansky and those people, we can always get Hoover to help us, which doesn't imply first-hand knowledge of blackmail on Susan's part. And even in that quote, Louis Rosenstein, a close associate of Roy Cohn, implies that it was not Cohn blackmailing Hoover, but rather, quote, Meyer Lansky and those people. This is significant because Susan Rosenstein's testimony from Official and Confidential is often cited as one of the central pieces of evidence supporting the existence of Roy Cohn's sexual blackmail operation. But even though Susan claimed to have seen Hoover participate in orgies and the photos that resulted, at no point in the book does Susan say explicitly that she knew that Roy Cohn specifically was blackmailing anyone. The section about Susan is immediately followed by quotes from two anonymous witnesses, totally unrelated to Rosenstein, who claimed that a fellow gay man in Washington, D.C. had shown them close-up photos of Hoover splayed out on a bed while dressed as a woman in 1948, some 10 years before the photos from the alleged orgies in the Plaza Hotel were taken. The man who showed them the photos didn't say anything about blackmail. They were presented in more of a, look at this crazy thing I have kind of context. Presumably, this anecdote was included to make Susan's story sound more convincing, but if true, that would bring us to a total of at least 3 or 4 different sets of blackmail photos of Hoover. A single, indistinct photo taken from far away that James Angleton showed to John Weitz in the 1950s. A set of photos including a clear close-up shot of Hoover's head, taken with a special lens in 1946, which Angleton showed to Gordon Novel in 1966, possibly from the same photo set. The photos of Hoover in drag posing on a bed seen by 2 anonymous gay men in 1948, and the 1958 photos of Hoover at the Blue Suite orgies. But logically, it seems like every true case of blackmail against Hoover would make the other allegations less likely to be true, not more. Hoover was by all accounts paranoid, reputation-obsessed, and especially sensitive to allegations of homosexuality. If he was getting blackmailed with compromising photos of himself in 1948, and then 10 years later, in 1958, he's hanging out at a gay orgy and someone whips out a camera, is it really plausible that he'd just sit there smiling like an idiot while they take pictures? Whitney Webb thinks so. In One Nation Under Blackmail, Webb speculates that Hoover was, quote, no longer concerned about being extorted or manipulated with sexual blackmail in ways that would end his career or destroy his public image. He had fallen in with the very crowd that had reportedly blackmailed him, later developing a symbiotic relationship with that same network. Obviously, Susan Rosensteel's claims cannot be proven true or false to any rigorous standard, but it is remarkable that the basic elements of the story of Hoover's blackmail, the cross-dressing, the gay sex acts, compromising photos, Meyer Lansky and his mafia associates, remained largely the same no matter which witness was telling the story. On the other hand, Susan's narrative of events does suffer from some obvious shortcomings: the lack of any physical or documentary evidence, the fact that no one seems to have gone public with their allegations until some 40 years after the alleged events, the fact that almost every witness is either dead, a convicted criminal, a spy, a mobster, or an ex-lover of one of the people involved, the lack of any contemporaneous evidence or documentation, and so on. But there was another blackmail ring, operating at roughly the same time, and in the same general area, which even seems to have targeted some of the same people, but which doesn't suffer from these shortcomings, not least because it was actually investigated by the NYPD and the FBI, who sent people to jail over it, a case which has come to be known as the Chickens and the Bulls. In late July 1965, a call came in to the Midtown Manhattan precinct of the NYPD from a Western Union office in Grand Central Station. A man who appeared to be impersonating a police officer had walked into the Western Union in the company of a 14-year-old runaway and had contacted the boy's father in Texas, asking him to wire $150 for plane fare to send the boy home. The father had grown suspicious after realizing the man was asking for nearly double the actual price of a plane ticket and decided to call police. The fake cop turned out to be a 34-year-old man named John Aitken, a felon with a prior conviction for child sexual abuse, who claimed he was just trying to do the boy a favor. Realizing that he was likely facing prison time, Aitken told police that he could provide them with information about a much bigger crime, involving famous names and large sums of money. He told a detective, James McDonnell, about an extortion ring that had targeted closeted gay men throughout the U.S., many of whom were married with families, listing off names of victims that included prominent politicians and entertainers. Over the next year, the NYPD and the FBI would discover the true extent of the operation. A blackmail ring of at least 70 men had extorted at least $2 million, that's about $20 million in 2025 money, from thousands of victims over less than a decade, with a list of victims that allegedly included Admiral William Church, the brother of the Democratic senator and famous CIA critic Frank Church, as well as the head of the American Medical Association, 2 generals, the Republican congressman and House Foreign Affairs Committee member Peter Frelinghuysen, Malcolm Forbes from Forbes magazine, a professor from Princeton University, the Catholic Cardinal of New York, Francis Spellman, famous rock musicians, a prominent surgeon, a prep school headmaster, multiple U.S. senators, heads of business firms, several well-known politicians, actors, singers, and television personalities, including Liberace, and perhaps most importantly, J. Edgar Hoover and his partner, Clyde Tolson. The blackmail ring, which was centered in New York and Chicago but operated all across the country, used several methods of extortion, but the most common ones involved sending attractive, often underage young men, referred to as chickens, into specific hotels frequented by older, wealthier homosexuals, intending to meet such men for purposes of prostitution, and then having members of the ring, known as bulls, intercede, posing as corrupt vice squad detectives, demanding bribes from the victim. In some cases, the chicken would lure the victim into a hotel room, and then once he was in a compromising position, the bulls would bust into the room, display their fake police badges, and handcuff the victim. After explaining the penalties for violating sodomy laws or corrupting a minor, the bulls would either directly solicit a bribe or tell the victim that he could pay, quote, bail money up front to prevent his arrest from going public. In other cases, the chicken would bring his victim into a hotel room and then rob him of his personal effects. The chickens would get to keep any money or valuables they stole, while the bulls kept the IDs and credit cards for themselves. Weeks later, after identifying the victim from his ID card, the bulls would contact him posing as corrupt police officers and suggest that he'd been identified in relation to a gay prostitution ring. The fake cops would convince the victim he was facing possible arrest or subpoena as a witness, and when they felt he was sufficiently scared, offer to make it all go away for a fee. Prosecuting the extortionists proved difficult, primarily because no one involved wanted to testify. The victims were understandably scared of the effects that being publicly outed would have on their families and careers, and most decided it simply wasn't worth coming forward. The chickens were mostly runaways and transient hustlers who were hard to track down, and the ones police were able to find weren't exactly ideal witnesses. The strategy the prosecutors settled on was to try to flip as many of the blackmail ring's members as possible and have them testify against each other or take plea deals to minimize the number of victims who would have to testify in open court. The investigation would reveal that despite employing at least 70 bulls and dozens, if not hundreds of male prostitutes, the ring was ultimately controlled by 3 men: John Pine, Sherman Kaminsky, and Ed Murphy. Operating out of Chicago was Pine, a former Chicago cop who maintained a nationwide network of police department employees as informants. When he was arrested, police found in his possession dozens of police badges and arrest forms, warrants, and extradition forms from virtually every jurisdiction in the country. Kaminsky, who used the alias Paul Vargo, was based out of New York, Baltimore, and Chicago, and is believed to have served in the Israeli army, although little else is known about his background. The third ringleader was a World War II veteran and convicted felon named Ed Murphy, who, in addition to running the blackmail ring, worked as both a pimp and a bouncer for various gay bars in New York. Just months before his apprehension in the Chickens and the Bulls case, Murphy had been arrested in a separate blackmail ring, operating out of the New York Hilton Hotel, which had extorted over $100,000 from wealthy gay men in much the same manner. Authorities announced the arrests as they happened, but press coverage was sporadic, and at the encouragement of the DA's office, the media refrained from identifying any of the victims or airing out any of the sordid sexual details. But there was another strange aspect to the media's treatment of the case. According to the book Stonewall by David Carter, a particularly noteworthy feature about the contemporary news accounts of this story is that the initial newspaper stories listed Edward Murphy as one of the arrested extortionists, but afterward, his name disappeared from the newspaper coverage. For example, in 9 New York Times articles on the case published between February 18, 1966 and July 12, 1967, Murphy was never mentioned again after the initial February 18, 1966 story. Yet the initial news story made it clear that Murphy was one of the three ringleaders, if not the head of the entire operation. In March of 1968, the New York Mattachine newsletter, published by the gay rights activist group, the Mattachine Society, asked why Murphy had not been sentenced for his role in the blackmail ring. The newsletter stated that not only had Murphy served several prior prison terms, but he also had recently pled guilty under a federal indictment to extortion charges and was under a number of indictments at the state level. After pleading guilty to the federal extortion charge, Murphy had merely been put on probation for 5 years. The newsletter reported that Mattachine, New York, had been informed that Murphy's sentence had been so often postponed because he'd made a deal to turn state's evidence, and the delays are to work out another deal to lighten his sentence. Murphy apparently did give evidence against the two other main figures in the ring, John J. Pine, a Chicago police officer, and Sherman Chadwick Kaminsky, a Bronx native who also went by the name Paul Vargo. However, that Murphy, after having been to prison several times before, could get off with serving only part of a 5-year sentence merely for giving evidence against his co-conspirators, despite shaking down approximately 1,000 men over almost 10 years, including a number of men of very eminent social rank as detailed earlier, is astonishing. Moreover, while several names emerged in the newspaper accounts as key players in the scheme, word on the street said that the gang had one ringleader. The New York Mattachine newsletter of March 1968 named Ed Murphy as that person. The theory of a single person at the head of the enterprise is bolstered by a letter from Richard Inman, a homophile activist battling police extortion of homosexuals in South Florida, written to Mattachine, Washington co-founder Jack Nichols in 1965. In the letter, Inman stated that he knew via a friend inside the FBI that there was one boss man of the syndicate's homo shakedown detail for the whole U.S. That Inman wrote the letter before the police uncovered the national ring adds to its credibility. But Murphy did even better in the waters he trawled. He landed the biggest fish of all, one whose value exceeded even that of money, because this one had the ability to keep law enforcement off his back. Murphy's operation landed none other than the nation's top law enforcement officer, J. Edgar Hoover. The same net that hauled in Hoover brought along a bonus prize, J. Edgar Hoover's longtime companion, Clyde Tolson, who was, moreover, an associate director of the FBI. The Mafia had photographic evidence implicating Hoover in homosexual activity, but it also came to light that Hoover at times dressed in female attire. Research conducted for this book strongly suggests that Ed Murphy had one or more of these photographs, which allowed him to avoid serving time in prison for leading an extensive national blackmail ring. Carter attributes these claims to, quote, research conducted for his book, but what proof does he offer? Well, he relates some anecdotes from the famous poet Allen Ginsberg, where Ginsberg claims that he had friends who encountered Hoover in various gay spots around Washington, D.C. Carter mentions a 1968 publication called The Homosexual Handbook, in which Hoover is listed as a prominent closeted homosexual, which was later withdrawn. He also cites the Anthony Summers book, Official and Confidential, which we've already covered here. But the only actual first-hand witness testimony Carter offers comes from his interviews with a guy named John Paul Rainieri. In another excerpt from his book Stonewall, David Carter writes, John Paul Rainieri, a former prostitute interviewed for this history, provided critical testimony for corroborating and better understanding the larger implications of Murphy's criminal enterprises for gay history. Rainieri said that as a youth from Westchester County, he'd been forced by blackmail and mafia-supplied drugs into a prostitution ring in which he remained active for 3 years before he escaped the mob's control. He claimed that a number of youths in the ring had disappeared after they got careless with talk, for while most of the customers were more or less average homosexual men with money, the regular clientele, according to Ranieri, also included famous men such as Malcolm Forbes, Cardinal Spellman, Liberace, U.S. senators, a vice president of the United States, one of the most famous rock musicians, and J. Edgar Hoover. Ranieri said that he met J. Edgar Hoover at private parties at the Plaza Hotel, and that Hoover's name was never mentioned. Hoover was always in drag, and Ranieri said he could tell that the FBI director was sure that no one recognized him. Ranieri said that he had ensured his own survival by having in his possession a photograph of himself with Hoover, given to him by the photographer. So, if you're keeping track, this brings us to a total of 5 alleged photo sets featuring Hoover in a compromising sexual position. But how credible are these claims? Well, unfortunately, the evidence overwhelmingly points to John Paul Ranieri being an unreliable witness. Ranieri was actually the subject of my first YouTube video, which I believe is the most complete collection of information about Ranieri currently in existence. But if you haven't seen it, in short, Ranieri was a press hound who gave wildly inconsistent accounts of his own background to multiple different journalists over time, including claims that he was a member of the supposed satanic cult in Yonkers, New York, that went on to commit the Son of Sam murders, and later became a friend and confidant of Jeffrey Dahmer during his killing spree in Milwaukee, all the while telling journalists contradictory stories about his early life. In fact, David Carter even acknowledges this in a footnote in his Stonewall book. John Paul Ranieri had a lifetime of mental health issues, and I did not always find his accounts of events to be reliable. For these reasons, I only used information from him that was corroborated by other sources. Following the section on Ranieri, Carter cites a 1993 New York Post article titled J. Edgar's Slip Was Showing. Shortly after Hoover's homosexuality and transvestism became public, and Anthony Summers's book Official and Confidential was published, a newspaper story about the 1960s national homosexual blackmail ring suddenly appeared after a quarter of a century of silence on the subject. Without mentioning Murphy's name, it quoted law enforcement sources who had worked on the case as saying that their investigation into the nationwide blackmail ring had turned up a photograph of Hoover posing amiably with the racket's ringleader and had uncovered information that Clyde Tolson, Hoover's lover, had himself fallen victim to the extortion ring. After federal agents joined the investigation, both the photograph of Hoover and the documents about Tolson disappeared. This New York Post story, referenced by Carter, apparently cites anonymous law enforcement sources who worked on the case, who said they'd actually found a photo of Hoover in a compromising position with the head blackmailer, Ed Murphy, and uncovered evidence that Clyde Tolson had been blackmailed. Curiously, all traces of this article seem to have been wiped from the internet. It isn't available on any newspaper archive sites or the New York Post website, and it doesn't appear to have been transcribed anywhere. For a mainstream news article published in 1993, this is pretty anomalous. Unfortunately, Carter gives us no indication whether or not he was able to track down these anonymous law enforcement sources cited by the Post, so it's hard to judge the credibility of these claims with any level of certainty. Personally, I couldn't shake a nagging suspicion that one of these anonymous sources could have been old James Rothstein himself, but that is, and seemingly will remain, pure speculation on my part. On the other hand, despite the DA's moratorium on naming the victims, the Chicken and the Bulls case did receive relatively substantial press coverage following the arrests and prosecutions of its ringleaders, even if it was largely treated as a local story. Compared to the cases covered thus far, the Chickens and the Bulls case was the only one which received contemporaneous press coverage, and more importantly, it actually went to trial, and at least some aspects were proven in court. In this sense, Ed Murphy's blackmail ring is among the best substantiated in American political history, with the most evidence to back it up. One fact that can't be discounted is the wild discrepancy in the sentences handed down to the different ringleaders. The ex-Chicago cop John Pine got 2 consecutive 20-year sentences. Sherman Kaminsky agreed to plead guilty, but during plea negotiations, one of his victims committed suicide, and fearing the possibility of additional manslaughter charges, Kaminsky fled, becoming a fugitive for 11 years. Kaminsky was apprehended in 1978, long after any press attention or political pressure had subsided, and he struck a deal with prosecutors to testify in a different case, this time against one of the central conspirators in the Orlando Letelier assassination, in exchange for admission into the Federal Witness Protection Program. This is perhaps one of the most bizarre intersections with intelligence agencies in this entire video. Letelier was a critic of the Augusto Pinochet regime of Chile, who was assassinated with a car bomb in Washington, D.C., ostensibly by agents of the Pinochet-era Chilean intelligence agency known as DINA. The assassination occurred in 1976 in the midst of the CIA's Operation Condor, a years-long campaign of terror in which the U.S. government helped its Latin American allies, virtually exclusively right-wing dictatorships, to carry out intelligence operations, coups, and assassinations against their left-wing opponents, both domestically and internationally. It's long been speculated that the CIA had at least tacitly approved, if not directly participated in Letelier's assassination as part of Operation Condor, either through training, funding, or just looking the other way. Kaminsky's role was as a jailhouse informant, testifying in court that one of the plot's alleged ringleaders had divulged incriminating information to him. It seems notable that this ex-con fugitive Kaminsky, almost immediately upon his arrest, turned federal informant in a highly politically sensitive case, providing information the government considered so valuable that it canceled out his years of blackmail. Was this a pre-existing relationship between Kaminsky and the feds? Had he been an informant all along, and the prosecutors or case agents just planted him in the same jail as the assassins, knowing they could rely on him to elicit a confession or just concoct one? This became an issue in the Letelier case, when the judge ultimately ruled that Kaminsky had been acting as an agent of the U.S. government when he questioned the alleged assassins in jail. But even Kaminsky's seemingly incredible good luck doesn't match the leniency shown to the actual ringleader, Ed Murphy. Despite having been charged in a separate blackmail operation just months before his arrest in the Chickens and the Bulls case, being under state-level indictments for blackmail in multiple states, and already having a long rap sheet, Murphy came out with a sentence of just 5 years probation with no prison time. And even more incredibly, the evidence suggests that Ed Murphy continued or even expanded his blackmail operation after being put on federal probation. According to David Carter's book, Stonewall, information uncovered in researching this history suggests that having the goods on Hoover, Ed Murphy continued to blackmail homosexual men, using the Stonewall Inn as a prime locale for this new extortion operation. There, he targeted professional gay men, especially those working on Wall Street, according to the same 1968 New York Magazine newsletter that asked why Ed Murphy had not been sentenced for his role in the national blackmail ring. Murphy had an interest in several gay bars in New York, including the Stonewall Inn, the only club identified in the article, and these clubs' membership lists had been used for blackmail. The Mattachine Society of New York has also been informed that Murphy has an interest in the Stonewall, a club on Christopher Street, and several other gay clubs in New York. Our source claims that the membership lists of some of these clubs are used to further extortion and shakedown schemes. Stronger evidence of Murphy using the Stonewall Inn for blackmail comes from a 1969 publication that quoted the Mattachine Society of New York. In the 1960s, it was not easy to find gay bars, and so, as a service, the Mattachine Society of New York began compiling lists of these bars. Eventually, a local guide was published by a small business venture as the Gay Scene Guide, and the publishers, on friendly terms with Mattachine, New York, quoted material from that organization's newsletter. Still, the bar lists remain just that, lists of gay bars, but with one exception. In the 1969 Gay Scene Guide, after the entry for the Stonewall Inn, there was a long quote from the New York Mattachine newsletter inserted in the midst of the brief descriptions of gay bars. The following news item was reported in the March 1968 Mattachine, New York newsletter and is presented here in condensed form. The Mattachine Society, Inc. of New York was instrumental in aiding DA Frank Hogan's office with information that led to the arrests of a number of blackmailers. Edward F.P. Murphy, an ex-convict who is alleged to have been the head of the National Ring, which recently was active in extorting money from homosexuals, has served prison terms for larceny and for carrying deadly weapons, and was arrested for impersonating an officer and for extortion, under federal indictment on extortion charges, permitted to plead guilty, and received a 5-year probation. On a number of indictments in the state courts, Murphy pleaded guilty on May 16, 1966. Sentencing has been postponed 6 times. He could get up to 15 years in prison as a second offender on the robbery charge alone. MSNY has also been informed that Murphy has an interest in the Stonewall, a club on Christopher Street, and several other gay clubs in New York. We caution our readers never to use your real name when cruising. Never give your address to a questionable bar or club. And remember, that trick or hustler you've just picked up may be working for the management. We urge you, if you've been intimidated or blackmailed in the past, to report it to the DA's office or to the MSNY. That a local guidebook took the unusual step of inserting a warning against giving out information to employees of the Stonewall Inn in the middle of a bar listing is more than suggestive. Indeed, several years later, Dick Leish was quite forceful about Murphy's role at the Stonewall Inn, writing that he seemed to be the manager of the place. The Homosexual Handbook reported that the burly at the door of the Stonewall Inn keeps boxes that hold, or are rumored to hold, thousands of cards, upon which are printed the particulars of the many thousands of customers, which echoes some of the ideas found in the New York Mattachine newsletter article and may explain part of how the blackmail routine operated. Did some customers naively believe that they were really being screened for membership in a private club, and that this screening would protect them by both excluding police officers and helping to establish the identity of the place they patronized as a legitimate private club? Beyond Murphy's involvement in the Stonewall Inn and in blackmailing gay men, he was deeply involved in male prostitution. Chuck Shaheen, who had a very high regard for Murphy, told Marty Duberman, "I knew Eddie Murphy for a long time. He was into young boys, most definitely, and was very, very involved with procurement of young boys." Danny Garvin recalls how he would always see these hustlers hanging out with Murphy. He had connections, and these hustler kids would hang out with him. Bob Kohler, who hated Murphy passionately, cited as evidence of Murphy's loathsomeness that he paid the youths he pimped with counterfeit money. Research on this book uncovered a couple of elusive references to a prostitution ring that was run on the second floor above the Stonewall Inn. When one looks at all the available evidence today, there is little doubt that such a ring operated out of the floor above the Stonewall Inn, although few know it existed. But by Murphy's own account, upstairs the mafia retained a room. But beyond the Stonewall being linked to blackmailing Wall Street employees and blackmailer Ed Murphy being connected to the Stonewall Inn, is there any piece of evidence that directly connects Murphy himself to blackmailing men on Wall Street? There is. In the late 1970s, a friend of Murphy's told Morty Manford that Ed Murphy said that he had been informing on the mob to the FBI. Murphy's friend went on to explain that because the mob had discovered that Murphy was an informer, Murphy had decided to come out, stop working with the mob, and quit informing because he wants to become a good guy. Manford reacted skeptically to Murphy's claim of being an FBI informer by saying, "I've heard that he was involved in a ring that was blackmailing homosexual men down at Wall Street." So does Carter's evidence here stand up to scrutiny? Much of his information came from gay rights organizations like the Mattachine Society in the context of explicit warnings to other gay men about Murphy's blackmail operations. It seems unlikely that activists like this would intentionally lie or report unsubstantiated rumors about a matter of such significance to their community, and the existence of contemporaneous documentary evidence like the Mattachine Society newsletters, as opposed to just decades-old anecdotes like in other cases, certainly lends the allegations some credibility. The quote where Murphy allegedly admitted to being an FBI informant came from an interview conducted by the International Gay Information Center with a famous gay rights activist named Morty Manford, but Manford was reporting secondhand information, something he'd allegedly heard from a friend of Murphy's. But even the most skeptical reading still has to explain Murphy's incredible ability to avoid arrest and incarceration, despite having been perhaps the most prolific gay blackmailer of his era, with a reputation for extortion that was so well established that gay rights organizations were printing warnings about him in their newsletters. Carter offers two possible explanations. Under one interpretation, Murphy was in possession of those alleged compromising photos of Hoover, and law enforcement prevented his incarceration and tolerated his later blackmail and pimping operations out of fear that he might expose the FBI director and his assistant. In the other version, Murphy had become a prolific FBI informant, and instead of blackmailing the agency, he was passing them information, ostensibly about the mafia. It's also easy to imagine a scenario in which Murphy was collecting the exact kinds of sexual blackmail material that Hoover coveted, and rather than snitching on the mafia, he was actually providing the Bureau with a point of leverage over certain powerful figures from Wall Street or the federal government. Carter even speculates that the raid which precipitated the Stonewall riots was actually intended to bust up Murphy's blackmail ring being operated out of the Stonewall Inn, rather than just to harass the bar's patrons as conventional wisdom dictates. Murphy would never be prosecuted again after taking his plea agreement in the Chickens and the Bulls case, and by the late 70s, his reputation had been transformed into that of an elder statesman of the gay rights movement and a fixture at gay pride events in New York City, including those commemorating the Stonewall riots. Perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that of all the alleged sexual blackmail rings of this era, the most well-substantiated one, with the most convincing evidence, was not motivated by some lofty ideological concern like Roy Cohn and his supposed anti-communist blackmail, but rather by the exact same thing that has motivated most criminals throughout history: greed. Murphy and his chickens weren't seeking political power or social status. Their goal was simply to make money. And Murphy's relationship with the FBI appears to have been purely transactional, to keep the Johns and their money flowing. It's also worth noting that informants are typically made to testify in court cases against the people they're informing on, but there's no evidence in the public record that Ed Murphy ever testified against anyone. Maybe Murphy's arrangement with the FBI was similar to Whitey Bulger's, where he just fed the Bureau information on other mafia figures, and in return was allowed to run his criminal operations free from state and federal interference. It does seem oddly coincidental that of the three ringleaders, two proved so valuable to the feds that they avoided prison completely, while the third was stuck with a then rare 40-year sentence. By all accounts, Murphy continued running his blackmail ring for another decade or so after taking the plea deal, years after his operation had become common knowledge among the more networked members of New York's gay scene. Was the FBI leveraging Murphy's ring to target diplomats, foreign spies, Wall Street bankers, UN delegates? At this point, we'll likely never know.
That's the end of part 1, and we're not even halfway through the 1960s yet. These videos take a lot of work, so if you want to see a part 2, then leave a comment, like the video, or subscribe. Thanks for watching.